Silence possesses a terrible, crushing weight. It smells of stale beeswax and cold fireplace ash. When Alistair finally pushed open his wife's bedroom door, after 3 years of polite, cowardly avoidance, the quiet hit him like a physical blow. She was leaving, and she wasn't making a sound. Rain battered the tall, warped glass of the west wing windows, sending uneven streams of water down the leaded panes. Alistair Covington, Duke of Pembroke, hated this side of the estate. It was perennially drafty. It smelled of damp plaster, old wool, and lingering abandonment. He had only ventured down this narrow, suffocating corridor because his study fire had smoked him out, and his steward had casually mentioned while pressing a blotter to a ledger that Her Grace had requested the heavy leather traveling trunks from the attic. Trunks, plural. Alistair's boots made dull, heavy thuds against the threadbare runner. He expected to hear shouting. He expected the frantic, high-pitched scurry of maids, the slamming of drawers, the hysterical sobbing that usually accompanied a titled woman's dramatic departure. That was how his mother had done it, packing for Bath every time his father drank too much port. It was a performance, a demand for an audience. But as Alistair paused outside Josephine's door, there was nothing. Just the rhythmic shh of rain and a faint, rhythmic rustling. He gripped the brass doorknob. The metal was ice cold. He turned it, the latch giving way with a sharp click that sounded like a gunshot in the stagnant air. Josephine did not look up. She was standing by the bed, her back to him. An enormous brass-bound trunk sat open on the mattress, smelling sharply of cedar and old leather. She was holding a heavy winter cloak, the dark green one he had bought her during their first year of marriage, back when he still tried. Her hands, which he vaguely remembered as soft and manicured, looked pale and raw at the knuckles. She folded the thick wool with a startling mechanical efficiency. Down the middle. Sleeves tucked in. A sharp press of her palms to flatten the bulk. Then, she placed it into the trunk. "Josephine," Alistair said. His voice rasped. It sounded loud and abrasive, completely out of place in this room. She turned. Her face was a study in absolute exhaustion. There was no anger in her pale blue eyes, no righteous fury, just the hollow, bruised look of someone who had simply stopped caring. A loose strand of dark brown hair had escaped her severe bun, curling limply against her neck. She looked right through him, blinked once, and turned back to the wardrobe. Alistair felt a sudden, bizarre flash of irritation. He had prepared himself for an argument. He had fortified his mind with logical, cold statements about duty, about the scandal of a separation, about the family name. He had his armor on, but she wasn't fighting. He stepped fully into the room, his eyes scanning the space he hadn't entered in 36 months. It was painfully sparse. The silver brushes he had gifted her were missing from the vanity. The small, framed watercolors of the Italian coast she loved so much had been taken down, leaving bright, unfaded squares against the peeling floral wallpaper. The fire in the grate was entirely dead. Nothing but a pile of gray ash and a half-burnt log. The room was freezing. "What are you doing?" he asked. A stupid question. The reality was staring him in the face, yet his brain refused to process the finality of it. "Packing." Her voice was a low murmur, devoid of inflection. She pulled open a drawer. The wood scraped loudly. She withdrew a stack of white cotton shifts, smelling faintly of dried lavender. "I can see that," Alistair snapped, his aristocratic drawl slipping into something harsher. "I mean, what is the meaning of this? Where do you think you are going?" "Yorkshire," she said simply. She walked past him to the trunk. He could smell her, not the heavy French perfumes the women in London wore, but something terribly ordinary. Pears, soap, dust. "Yorkshire," he repeated, the word tasting bitter. "To your sister's cottage? In November? You will freeze." Josephine pressed the cotton shifts into the corner of the trunk. She traced the leather seam with her index finger, ensuring the fabric laid flat. "I will manage." "I forbid it," he said. The words tasted like ash. They sounded pathetic, even to him. She stopped. For a fleeting second, her shoulders hitched. Then, She slowly straightened her spine and turned to face him again. She didn't cross her arms. She didn't puff out her chest. She just stood there, looking at him like he was a slightly confusing stranger asking for directions. "You forbid it," she repeated. It wasn't a question. It was a flat, dull echo. "Alistair, you haven't spoken more than 10 consecutive words to me since the King's Jubilee. You haven't looked me in the eye since." She stopped. The air in the room seemed to curdle. "Since the blood. Since the screaming in the night. Since the midwife came out of this very room carrying a basin of red water and a tiny, still bundle wrapped in linen." Alistair swallowed hard, his throat clicking. The starch of his cravat felt like a garrote. He averted his gaze, looking instead at a scuff mark on the floorboards. It was an old reflex. Look away. Shut down. Retreat. It had been his survival mechanism for 3 years. If he didn't look at her, he didn't have to see the gaping, festering hole in their marriage. "I have provided for you," he managed to say, clinging to the only tangible defense he had. "You have this house. You have your allowance. You have everything a duchess requires." Josephine let out a breath. It wasn't a sigh. It was just the sound of a lung emptying itself. "I have a title," she said softly. "I have a massive, echoing mausoleum where the servants look at me with pity. I have a husband who lives in London and only returns for the hunting season, during which he sleeps in the East Wing and drinks until he forgets I reside in the West." She walked back to the wardrobe. Her movements were calm, deliberate. She reached up and pulled down a small, worn leather valise. "I am 30 years old, Alistair. I am tired of being a ghost in my own life." Minutes bled into the cold air, stretching the silence until it felt brittle enough to snap. Alistair stood rooted to the spot, his expensive leather boots feeling leaden. The floorboards finally groaned as he shifted his weight, a sharp crack that shattered the room's fragile quiet. Josephine didn't flinch. She simply unbuckled the valise. The harsh metallic scrape of the clasp echoed off the bare walls. "You are acting impulsively," Alistair said. He hated how reasonable he sounded. He hated that his tone was the exact one he used when negotiating grain tariffs with his tenants. "It is the weather. It makes everyone melancholy. I will have the housekeeper light a proper fire in here. We will discuss this over dinner." Josephine paused. Her fingers rested lightly on the brass buckle. "There is nothing to discuss. I am not negotiating a treaty, Alistair. I am leaving." He closed the distance between them, stepping far too close. He wanted to intimidate her into stopping, to use his sheer physical presence to halt this slow-motion disaster. He reached out and grabbed the edge of a heavy wool shawl she was about to fold. "Stop," he commanded, his voice dropping an octave. Josephine didn't pull the shawl away. She let go of it entirely. The fabric dropped into his hands, soft and heavy. She simply turned back to the wardrobe for something else. The rejection was absolute. If she had yanked it back, it would have been a fight, a connection. By letting go, she proved how little he mattered. Alistair stared at the shawl in his hands. It was gray, frayed at the edges. Why was a duchess wearing frayed wool? A sudden sharp spike of shame pierced through his irritation. He didn't know what she wore. He didn't know how she spent her days. He had spent 3 years ensuring he knew absolutely nothing about her. "I am your husband," he said to her back. "Legally," she agreed, pulling out a pair of sensible, thick-soled walking boots. She carried them to the trunk and wedged them against the cedar siding. "And for the last 3 years, I've honored that legal contract by staying out of your way, smiling at the local vicar, and not causing a scandal. I consider my debt paid." "Debt?" Alistair dropped the shawl onto the mattress. "Is that what this is? A transaction?" Josephine finally turned, and this time the hollow look in her eyes cracked, revealing something dark and wet underneath. "Isn't it? What else do we have left?" She walked toward her vanity, pulling open the top drawer. She bypassed the velvet jewelry boxes holding the Covington diamonds. Instead, she reached for a small, cheap wooden box. Her hand trembled slightly as she pulled it out. Alistair recognized the box. His stomach plummeted, leaving him nauseous and hollow. It was the box that held the only physical evidence of the child they had lost. A lock of hair, a tiny silver rattle. She opened it. The tiny hinge squeaked. She didn't look at the contents, just snapped it shut and walked toward her valise. "Don't," Alistair whispered. The word tore its way out of his throat, jagged and unpolished. She stopped, looking at him over her shoulder. "Don't what? Don't take my own grief with me? Or don't remind you of yours?" "Josephine, please." He didn't know what he was asking. "Please don't leave. Please don't open that box. Please don't make me feel this." "I needed you," she said. Her voice was terribly quiet, barely louder than the rain striking the glass. Afterward, "I needed you to sit with me in the dark. I needed you to hold my hand while I bled. But you couldn't stand the sight of my grief. It offended you. So you left." "I didn't leave," he lied instinctively, his jaw tight. "I went to London to handle estate business. I provided the best physicians." "You sent a man with a bag of leeches and a bottle of laudanum," she corrected, her voice entirely flat. "And you stayed away for 5 months. When you came back, you knocked on my door, asked if I was quite well, and then moved your things to the East Wing." She placed the wooden box into the valise, burying it beneath a pair of thick wool stockings. "You didn't want a wife who wept, Alistair. You wanted a portrait, and I tried to be a portrait. I sat very still. I gathered dust. But I am suffocating in this house." Alistair watched her hands. They were shaking now. The mechanical rhythm had broken. She was trying to unfasten a cameo brooch from her collar, but her fingers were clumsy. The pin snapped open, pricking her thumb. A tiny bead of bright crimson blood welled up against her pale skin. She dropped the brooch. It clattered against the floorboards, rolling to a stop against the toe of Alistair's boot. He looked down at it. It was cheap. Carved shell, a gift from her late father. He bent down slowly. His knees popped. He picked up the brooch, the metal cold against his palm. He held it out to her. Josephine hesitated. She looked at his hand, large, manicured, a heavy gold signet ring on his little finger. She reached out. As her fingers pinched the brooch, her skin brushed his. It was an electric shock. Her hand was freezing. His was unnaturally warm. For a fraction of a second, Alistair's hand clamped down, trapping her fingers against the cold cameo. He felt the frantic, rabbit-like thumping of her pulse in her wrist. He looked up, meeting her eyes. For the first time in years, he truly looked at her. He saw the dark circles under her eyes, the fine lines of strain around her mouth, the rigid way she held her jaw to keep it from trembling. He saw a woman who had broken into pieces and glued herself back together entirely alone. "Let go," she whispered. The command was soft, but it carried the weight of a dying breath. Alistair felt his chest constrict. He wanted to pull her against him. He wanted to bury his face in her drab practical dress and apologize until his voice gave out. But the vast, icy chasm he had dug between them felt uncrossable. He didn't know how to comfort her. He only knew how to run. Slowly, agonizingly, Alistair uncurled his fingers. Josephine pulled her hand back, slipping the brooch into her pocket. She turned away from him, closing the valise with a decisive snap. "My carriage is waiting at the rear servants' entrance," she said, her back to him once more. "I did not want to cause a spectacle in the main drive. I trust you won't make a scene now." Rainwater pooled in the deep ruts of the rear carriage path, reflecting the dull, bruised purple of the November twilight. Josephine did not wait for Alistair to say another word. She picked up her valise, the worn leather handle creaking under the sudden weight, and walked past him. She did not brush his shoulder. She gave him a wide, deliberate berth, as if he were a piece of unstable architecture she feared might collapse on her. Alistair turned, his boots scuffing the bare floorboards, and watched her walk down the narrow, unlit corridor toward the back of the house. The servant's wing. He followed. He did not know why he was following. It was a pathetic, entirely involuntary reaction, like a dog trailing after a wagon that had long ago stopped throwing scraps. He kept a distance of about 10 paces, the shadows of the drafty hallway swallowing the space between them. The air here smelled different. It lacked the polish and beeswax of the main house, replaced by the heavy, utilitarian odors of lye soap, boiled cabbage, and damp stone. It was an offensive environment for a duchess. It was an offensive environment for his wife. Yet she moved through it with a tired familiarity that made Alistair's stomach twist. How often had she walked these back halls to avoid him in the main galleries? She reached the top of the servants' staircase. It was a steep, treacherous descent of raw oak planks, worn into shallow dips in the center by decades of hurrying maids. A solitary, draft-blown candle flickered in a sconce halfway down, casting erratic, dancing shadows against the weeping plaster. Josephine paused at the top step. The valise was heavy, dragging her right shoulder down, pulling the cheap fabric of her practical dress taut across her back. She shifted her grip, her knuckles flashing white in the gloom. "Let me take that," Alistair said. His voice startled him. It bounced off the narrow walls, sounding completely alien, too loud, too commanding, yet entirely devoid of actual authority. Josephine didn't jump. She simply turned her head slightly, her profile illuminated by the weak candlelight from below. No, it was just one word. Not a protest, not an argument, just a complete dismissal. She took the first step down. Her thick-soled boot hit the wood with a dull thud. Then the next. She moved carefully, awkwardly, the bulk of the valise banging against her hip, threatening to unbalance her. Alistair stood at the top, his hand gripping the rough, unvarnished newel post. He could easily overtake her. He could physically remove the bag from her hand. But the sheer, exhausting effort of crossing that invisible boundary she had drawn around herself paralyzed him. He was a duke. He commanded hundreds of tenants, spoke in the House of Lords, dictated the flow of massive agricultural wealth. But he could not figure out how to take a leather bag from his wife's hand without feeling like he was committing a violent intrusion. He followed her down, step by agonizing step, matching his pace to her slow, encumbered descent. At the bottom of the stairs, the heavy oak door leading to the kitchen courtyard stood ajar. A freezing, wet wind howled through the gap, carrying the smell of wet earth, horse sweat, and manure. A plain, uncrusted carriage sat waiting in the mud. It wasn't the Covington primary coach with its velvet squabs and sprung suspension. It was the estate's secondary vehicle, normally used for fetching the apothecary or transporting the steward to town. A footman, a broad-shouldered lad named Henry, whose livery was missing a brass button, was currently struggling to strap Josephine's large cedar trunk to the rear boot. O'Malley, the head groom, stood by the horses. He was soaked through, his heavy wool coat plastered to his shoulders, rainwater dripping from the brim of his battered felt hat. The horses were restless, stomping their heavy hooves into the muck, their breath pluming in thick white clouds against the darkening sky. When Henry saw Alistair emerge from the doorway, the boy froze, dropping the leather strap into the mud. O'Malley stiffened, his hand flying to his hat brim. The sheer panic in their eyes was unmistakable. They were aiding the Duchess in a clandestine departure, and the master of the house had just caught them. "Your Grace," Henry stammered, taking a clumsy step back, nearly tripping over the muddy strap. Alistair ignored them. He was staring at the back of Josephine's head. She stepped out into the rain. She didn't pull her hood up. The freezing water immediately darkened the brown hair at her nape, plastering the loose strands to her skin. She walked straight to the carriage door. She didn't wait for Henry to open it. She wrenched the latch herself, the rusted metal letting out an ugly shriek, and threw her valise onto the floorboards. "Josephine," Alistair said again. He stepped out into the courtyard. The rain hit his face like tiny, icy needles. His pristine boots sank immediately into the slurry of mud and straw. She stopped, one foot on the iron carriage step. She didn't turn around. She just rested her forehead against the wet, painted wood of the doorframe. Her shoulders heaved once. "Go back inside, Alistair," she said, her voice muffled, fighting against the sound of the driving rain. "You are ruining your boots." It was the most devastating thing she could have said. It wasn't an insult. It was an observation of his priorities. She actually believed he cared more about his Italian leather than the fact that his wife was leaving him. And the sickening truth was, for 3 years, he had given her every reason to believe exactly that. "Do not do this," he managed, the words scraping his throat. She finally turned. Her face was wet, though whether from rain or tears, he couldn't tell. The cynicism in her eyes was total. It was a dense, impenetrable wall. "I have already done it," she replied. I did it 1,000 times in my head while sitting in that freezing room. Now my body is just catching up. She hoisted herself into the carriage. The door slammed shut with a concussive bang that made the horses flinch. O'Malley, reading the absolute finality in the sound, scrambled onto the driver's box, not daring to look at Alistair again. Henry hastily secured the final strap on the trunk and practically ran back toward the stables. Alistair stood in the mud. He listened to the wet, sucking sound of the carriage wheels tearing themselves free from the mud. He watched the heavy wooden spokes turn, throwing clumps of earth into the air. He watched the uncrested carriage roll out of the courtyard, turn down the long avenue of bare, skeletal elm trees, and disappear into the heavy November gloom. He didn't yell. He didn't run after it. He just stood there until his clothes were completely soaked through, and the cold had seeped so deeply into his bones that he could no longer feel his fingers. Footsteps echoed against the damp plaster of the servants' corridor, but they were only his own. Alistair dragged himself back up the narrow, winding staircase. His clothes were heavy, clinging to his skin like a wet shroud. Water dripped from the hem of his coat, leaving dark, irregular stains on the worn oak steps. He reached the main level and bypassed the heavy double doors that led to the east wing to his warm study, his decanter of scotch, his blazing fire. Instead, he turned left, his boots squeaking miserably against the floorboards, and walked back to the room she had just abandoned. The door was still wide open, exactly as he had left it. He walked inside. It felt emptier now, though the only things missing were one trunk, a valise, and a woman who had barely made a sound anyway. Yet the vacuum she left behind was suffocating. Alistair closed the door behind him. The latch clicked shut, sealing him inside the freezing, stale air. He walked to the center of the room and stopped. His wet clothes were chilling him to the core, his muscles spasming slightly under the wet wool, but he made no move to strip them off. He deserved the cold. He wanted it to bite. He looked at the bed. The heavy mattress bore a deep, rectangular indentation where her trunk had sat for the last hour. He walked over to it and placed his hand against the quilt. The fabric was cold. Everything was cold. A sudden, violent wave of nausea hit him. It wasn't a delicate, aristocratic swoon. It was a raw, biological reaction to an overwhelming psychological collapse. He gagged, bending forward, his hands gripping the edge of the mattress to keep from falling. His tight cravat felt like a hangman's noose. He reached up with clumsy, numb fingers and tore at the silk, ripping it away from his throat and throwing it onto the floor. He sucked in a ragged breath, but the air smelled of stale beeswax and the dead ash in the fireplace. It smelled like a tomb, because that's what this was. He had turned this room into a crypt for a living woman. Alistair forced himself to stand upright. He turned toward her vanity. The drawers were slightly misaligned, pushed shut in a hurry. He walked over to the cheap peeling piece of furniture and gripped the brass handles of the top drawer. He pulled it open. It was empty, save for a few stray hairpins that had rolled into the corner and a fine layer of dust. He slammed the drawer shut. The loud crack made him flinch. He opened the next one. Empty. He opened the wardrobe. A few moth-eaten gowns she hadn't bothered to take hung limply from wooden hangers. They looked like ghosts, hollow and abandoned. His eyes fell to the floor, near the vanity. There, hidden half beneath the shadow of the carved leg, was a tiny, glinting object. Alistair knelt, his soaked trousers plastered against his knees, the cold seeping through. He reached under the vanity and retrieved the object. It was the cameo brooch, the cheap, carved shell. She had dropped it when she pricked her finger, and in the tension of the moment, neither of them had retrieved it. He held it in the palm of his hand. There was a microscopic smear of dried rust-colored blood on the silver pin. Her blood. The dam broke. 3 years of meticulously constructed stoicism, 3 years of pretending that if he just ignored the silence, it wouldn't deafen him, shattered completely. It didn't happen with a roar or a dramatic sob. It happened with a pathetic, high-pitched wheeze that escaped his chest, followed by a total collapse of his posture. He slumped against the side of the vanity, sitting flat on the freezing floorboards, pulling his knees up, ignoring the wet fabric sticking to his skin. He clutched the cheap cameo in his large, shaking hand, pressing the sharp silver pin directly into his palm until it dug into the flesh, needing the physical pain to anchor him. God, he whispered to the empty room. The memory of the night they lost, the child hit him. Not the sanitized version, he told himself, but the reality. He remembered standing in the hallway, listening to her guttural, animalistic screams of pain and loss. He remembered the physician walking out, shaking his head, wiping his hands on a towel. He remembered walking into the room, smelling the heavy, metallic stench of copper and sweat. He remembered seeing Josephine, pale as parchment, her eyes wild, reaching her arms out to him. And he remembered turning around and walking out. He had told himself he was fetching more help. He had told himself he needed to arrange the burial. He had constructed 100 administrative excuses to justify why he could not stand by that bed. But the truth, sitting here on the floor 3 years later, was painfully clear. He had been terrified. He had seen the agonizing reality of human fragility, the chaotic, messy, horrifying nature of death, and he had sprinted in the opposite direction. He had punished her for being the vessel of that trauma. He had isolated her because looking at her reminded him of his own ultimate cowardice. He had demanded she be a quiet, dignified portrait because the living, grieving woman was too much for him to handle. Alistair squeezed his eyes shut. A single, hot tear leaked out, cutting a warm path down his freezing cheek. It tasted like salt and defeat. He sat there for a long time, the shadows lengthening, the rain continuing its relentless assault against the warped glass. He was a man who had successfully managed thousands of acres, but he had entirely bankrupted his own soul. Slowly, the numbness in his legs began to burn. The physical discomfort finally forced him to open his eyes. He looked at the indentation on the bed again. He looked at the empty drawer. He looked at the cameo in his hand. She was going to Yorkshire. It was a 3-day journey by carriage. The roads would be mud-choked and treacherous. She was traveling in an unheated, uncrested estate coach with an aging driver and a terrified footman. Alistair didn't stand up with a sudden burst of heroic resolve. He felt sick, exhausted, and utterly loathsome. He was terrified of what she would say to him if he caught her. He was terrified of the look of profound exhaustion in her eyes. But sitting in this tomb, smelling the dead ash, he realized something far worse. If he let her cross the county line, he would officially become a ghost himself. He pushed himself off the floor, his joints popping, his wet clothes heavy and unyielding. He didn't ring for a servant. He didn't change his clothes. He walked out of the room, clutching the cameo so tightly his knuckles turned white, and headed back down the stairs toward the stables. Lantern light bled through the cracked wooden slats of the main stables, casting fractured, restless shadows across the flooded yard. Alistair shoved the heavy door open, the rusted hinges squealing against the roar of the downpour. The interior smelled fiercely of ammonia, damp hay, and the warm, heavy musk of resting animals. Henry, still soaking wet and shivering violently in his ruined livery, was attempting to hang a damp bridle on a peg. He dropped it the moment Alistair appeared. Alistair didn't look at the boy. He walked straight to the third stall, where a massive, deep-chested, dapple-gray hunter was aggressively chewing on a mouthful of oats. The horse snorted, stomping a hoof against the packed dirt floor. "Saddle him!" Alistair barked. His teeth were chattering, his jaw tight to keep his voice from vibrating. "Your Grace?" Henry squeaked, paralyzed. "Saddle the damn horse, Henry, or I will do it myself and fire you immediately after." The boy scrambled. There was no time for proper brushing or care. A cold, stiff leather saddle was thrown over the gray's back, the girth tightened with frantic, clumsy pulls. Alistair didn't wait for a riding crop or a heavy cloak. He hauled himself up into the saddle. His wet trousers immediately wicked the cold moisture from the leather, chilling his thighs to the bone. He dug his heels into the gray's flanks. The horse surged forward, tearing out of the stable into the blinding rain. The estate road was an unnavigable nightmare. The gravel had washed away, leaving deep, treacherous channels of thick clay and pooling water. The gray slipped twice, its hindquarters dropping, muscles straining wildly to find purchase in the muck. Alistair clung to the reins, the coarse, wet mane whipping against his knuckles. He couldn't see more than 10 feet ahead. The rain was a physical wall, driving into his eyes, tasting of grit and chalk. His lungs burned. The cold had settled so deeply into his chest that every breath felt jagged. But his right hand, clenched tight around the reins, still pressed the tiny carved cameo into his palm. The sharp pin was a constant, biting anchor. They rode for 2 miles. The darkness was absolute, save for the weak, bruised purple of the horizon. Then he saw it. A faint, swinging halo of yellow light struggling through the curtain of rain. The uncrested carriage was moving at a pathetic, agonizing crawl. The wheels were sinking half a foot into the mud with every rotation. O'Malley was standing on the driver's box, shouting hoarsely at the exhausted horses, his whip cracking uselessly over their heads. Alistair pushed the gray harder, the horse's chest heaving like a bellows. As he pulled alongside the carriage, he leaned over, risking a broken neck if the horse stumbled. "Halt!" Alistair roared. The wind swallowed the sound entirely. He kicked the gray forward, cutting directly across the lead horse's path. The carriage horses panicked, rearing and plunging into the deep mud. O'Malley screamed a curse, throwing his entire weight backward onto the brake lever. The heavy wooden wheels locked, skidding blindly, before grinding to a violent, shuddering halt that tilted the entire chassis dangerously to the left. Alistair didn't dismount properly. He practically fell from the saddle. His boots hit the sloped, treacherous mud, and his legs, completely numb from the cold and the ride, buckled. He dropped to his knees in the freezing sludge. He didn't care. He scrambled up, his immaculate waistcoat coated in a thick, vile layer of brown slurry. He grabbed the carriage door handle. The metal was slick with rain. He wrenched it downward, throwing his shoulder against the painted wood, and yanked the door open. Inside it was pitch black. The air smelled intensely of damp wool, cedar, and pears. Josephine was pressed against the far corner of the velvet squabs, her hands gripping the window strap. Her eyes were wide, flashing in the ambient light of the carriage lantern. When she saw him standing there, gasping for air, coated in filth, his hair plastered to his skull like a drowned rat, the fear in her face morphed into a profound, exhausted confusion. Alistair tried to speak, but his throat seized. He stood in the freezing mud, the rain violently beating against his back, and simply looked at her. All his carefully rehearsed speeches about duty and propriety evaporated. He reached forward, his arm trembling so badly the wet sleeve shook. He opened his hand. Sitting in his muddy, scraped palm was the carved shell cameo. Josephine looked at it. She looked at the tiny, rusted smear on the silver pin. Her breath hitched. It was a microscopic sound, but in the enclosed space of the carriage, it was deafening. "You dropped it," Alistair rasped. His voice was completely broken, sounding like grinding stones. She stared at the brooch, then slowly lifted her gaze to his face. "You rode through a winter gale to return a piece of cheap shell." "I was a coward," Alistair said. The confession tore out of him, ragged and unpolished. He gripped the door frame, his knuckles white, kneading the wood to keep from collapsing entirely. "I am a coward." "When they took him away, when you screamed, I couldn't breathe. I looked at you bleeding in that bed, and I realized I could not fix it. I couldn't buy a cure. I couldn't negotiate a treaty. I was completely, utterly powerless." He swallowed, the rain mixing with the salt of his tears, blinding him. "So I punished you. I isolated you, because your grief was a mirror showing me my own failure. You were dying in that room, Josephine, and I shut the door because I was too terrified to watch." The rain hammered against the carriage roof. Josephine didn't move. She didn't reach out to touch him. She didn't offer a gentle, forgiving smile. The bruised, hollow look in her eyes remained, but the impenetrable wall of cynicism had cracked. "Apologies do not rewrite history, Alistair," she said softly. Her voice lacked malice, but it held the heavy, undeniable weight of truth. "They do not warm a bed that has been cold for 3 years. They do not bring back the dead." "No," Alistair agreed, his voice cracking. He bowed his head, resting his forehead against the muddy doorframe. "They don't. But you said you needed me to sit with you in the dark. I am 3 years late, Josephine, but I am here. I am here." Silence stretched between them, heavier than the storm outside. Alistair kept his eyes closed, waiting for the final rejection, waiting for her to tell him to close the door. He heard the rustle of heavy wool. "You are ruining my velvet cushions, Alistair," she murmured. Alistair snapped, his eyes open. Josephine had shifted slightly on the bench, leaving a space beside her in the cramped, freezing dark. "The carriage is going to Yorkshire," she said, her voice entirely flat, though her hands were trembling as she pulled her frayed shawl tighter. "It is a 3-day journey. If you want to sit in the dark, you will have to do it there." Alistair stared at her. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't a miraculous restoration of their marriage. It was simply an open door. A brutal, uncomfortable, exhausting road ahead. He didn't hesitate. He pulled himself up into the carriage, bringing the mud, the rain, and the cold with him, and pulled the door shut against the storm. If you felt the raw tension of Alistair's desperate ride and Josephine's grounded, imperfect choice, drop a like and share this video with a fellow historical drama lover. Do you think a 3-day carriage ride to Yorkshire is enough to start fixing 3 years of painful silence, or is this just the beginning of a much harder road? Subscribe and hit the notification bell for more deeply human emotional storytelling. Thank you for watching.